This was supposed to be the climb of a lifetime, but no one ever came back. In August 1995, 8 climbers stood on the summit of K2, the deadliest mountain on Earth. Hours later, a violent storm erased them from history. No mayday, no final message, just silence. One of them was Alison Hargreaves, a mother of 2. She had just conquered Everest without oxygen, alone. Now she was chasing her final dream. "I want to be with my children," she wrote in her journal, "but maybe summiting K2 would give them a better future." She never saw them again. The mountain took her, and 7 more. Some were veterans, some were climbing K2 for the first time. But all of them were strong. All of them believed they would come back. They didn't. This is not just a story about a storm. It's about ambition, regret, and the thin line between courage and tragedy. You've heard of Everest, but this is K2. And it doesn't forgive. They call it the Savage Mountain. K2 rises like a blade into the sky, 8,611 meters of unforgiving stone, snow, and ice. It's the second highest mountain on Earth, and arguably the most dangerous. Everest may be taller, but K2 is steeper, colder, and far more brutal. On this peak, the margin for error is almost zero. One step too late, one cloud too thick, and you vanish. By the early 1990s, only 113 climbers had ever stood on K2's summit. 38 had died trying. That's more than 1 for every 3 who made it, and those who survive often return changed, some never climbing again. It's a mountain that doesn't care about your experience, your dreams, or the promises you made to your family. In the climbing world, there's a silent reverence for K2. It's not just a peak, it's a question. One that asks, how much are you willing to risk? And yet, they keep coming. Because for some, K2 isn't a warning, it's a calling. It's the place you go when Everest isn't enough. A place where every step upward is a fight against gravity, frostbite, and fear. There are no shortcuts here, no guided tours to the top, only cold, commitment, and consequences. This mountain has no base camp cafes or crowds, no fixed ropes laid out by armies of Sherpas. On K2, you carry your own weight, both physical and emotional. It demands more than strength, it demands soul. Maybe that's why K2 is the mountain where legends are made and lost. Because those who climb it don't just want to reach the summit. They want to stand where few dare to prove something to the world. Or maybe just to themselves. But in 1995, 8 of those climbers reached the summit and never made it back. Alison Hargreaves was not supposed to be on that mountain. She'd already done the impossible. Soloed Everest, and without oxygen, without Sherpas, without anyone to lean on but herself. A single mother with 2 children waiting at home in England, she had risked everything to build a name in a world that often left women behind. But Everest wasn't enough. Not for her. K2 was the next step. And maybe, just maybe, the last piece of a life she was desperately trying to hold together. She was in debt. Her climbing shop back home had closed. The sponsors weren't coming like they used to. And in her journal, she wrote of being torn apart, wanting to summit but missing her children. With an ache so deep, she cried on the descent trail. "It eats away at me," she wrote, "wanting the children and wanting K2. I feel like I'm being pulled into." She wasn't just chasing a summit. She was chasing security, identity, maybe even peace. While Hargreaves battled her own doubts, another figure was quietly preparing for the climb of his life. Commitment, Rob Slater. And consequences. Rob was bold, intense, and to some, reckless. He didn't have the high-altitude resume most climbers carried up K2. In fact, he had never submitted anything higher than 7,000 meters. And now, here he was, preparing for a no-oxygen ascent of the most dangerous mountain in the world. But Rob had heart. He trained hard, studied the route, obsessed over every detail. He believed that preparation could bridge the gap between dream and disaster. It wasn't arrogance, it was hunger. He wanted K2 because it represented everything uncertain, everything unsolved. It was the ultimate test of will. He wasn't alone. The Spanish teams were some of the most experienced on the mountain. Men like Javier Escartin, Lorenzo Ortiz, and Javier Olivar were veterans of the Karakoram. They moved with discipline, relying on each other like family. K2 wasn't just a goal, it was a return to something sacred. They had already lost one of their own, Jordi Angles, in a fall earlier that season. But they pressed on, because that's what climbers do. You don't run from the mountain, you climb until it tells you otherwise. And then there was Peter Hillary, son of Sir Edmund Hillary, the man who conquered Everest. Peter grew up in the shadow of greatness, but he never tried to live in it. He had his own mountains to climb, his own fears to face. On K2, he brought with him experience, but also something rare: humility. While others pushed forward, Peter watched the sky. Everyone's looking at everyone else, thinking, they're feeling all right, so it must be all right, he would later say. It's hard to go against that. This was no ordinary climbing season. 7 expeditions from 7 different nations all converged on one deadly ridgeline. And in those thin, icy altitudes where oxygen fades and judgment blurs, they would soon have to make choices that meant life or death. August 13th, 1995, Camp 4, nearly 8,000 meters above sea level. After weeks of storms and waiting, the weather finally broke. The summit was in sight, clear skies above, calm winds, and just enough hope to move. For once, K2 looked quiet, peaceful even, but no one should ever trust a calm on the savage mountain. That night, beneath the ceiling of stars, the climbers prepared for their final push. Crampons tightened, headlamps clicked on, boots crunched into the ice. 8 climbers would leave Camp 4 for the top. Rob Slater, Alison Hargreaves, Bruce Grant, Javier Olivar, Javier Escartin, Lorenzo Ortiz, and later, Peter Hillary and Canadian Jeff Lakes followed behind. They moved in silence. Every breath was a struggle. Every step stole energy they couldn't afford to lose. But still, they climbed. Back at Camp 4, 2 Spaniards, Lorenzo Ortas and Pepe Garcés, stayed behind. Ortas wasn't feeling well. He watched the headlamps drift upward into darkness, like stars falling in reverse. He didn't know it yet, but staying behind would save his life. By midday, they were scattered across the bottleneck, the most infamous stretch on K2, a narrow couloir of snow and ice that snakes beneath a monstrous overhanging sérac, always threatening to collapse without warning. It's a place where time slows down and every movement echoes with consequence. At around 6,300 meters back at base camp, the teams stared up through telescopes, holding their breath. The summit push was underway, but the weather had started whispering again. High clouds rolled in from the north, and a strange haze began wrapping itself around the peak. Peter Hillary, halfway up the bottleneck, noticed it immediately. An ominous bank of cloud had blanketed western China, he remembered. It swept over K2, climbing higher and higher, licking the summit like a warning. Hillary turned back. Something in his gut told him this wasn't right. Canadian Jeff Lakes hesitated but pushed on a little further. The rest of the team kept climbing. By 6:30 p.m., a radio call came in. It was Lorenzo Ortiz, crackling over static, exhausted but triumphant. Too late, we are on the summit. He wasn't alone. Within minutes, 5 more climbers had reached the top. Alison Hargreaves, Rob Slater, Javier Escartin, Javier Olivar, Bruce Grant. They had done it, but they had arrived too late. The summit was behind them, but daylight was nearly gone. The wind, once silent, had started to rise. And K2 does not give second chances. As the climbers began their descent from the summit, the mountain changed. The soft winds that brushed the peak in the afternoon turned violent by nightfall. A dry, screaming gale swept down from the north, cold enough to burn skin in seconds, fast enough to tear tents from the rock. It hit Camp 4 first, where Ortas and Garcés were waiting. Their tent collapsed almost instantly. One moment they were lying inside. The next, they were clinging to shredded nylon in the open air, their gloves ripped away by the storm. Above them, the summit team was descending into darkness, blind, exhausted, and alone. No one had expected hurricane-force winds. There was no shelter above 8,000 meters. No escape route. No chance to wait it out. Ortas and Garcés tried to stay alive by pressing their backs against the ice where the tent had once stood. With no gloves, they used their bare hands to hold what fabric remained. Their fingers began to go numb. Then their toes. Time stretched. The wind howled louder. Somewhere above, their friends were fighting for every step, every breath. And the storm was only getting started. Further down the mountain, Peter Hillary was already descending. His decision to turn back may have saved his life. But it didn't spare him the storm. The wind slammed into him like a wall. Visibility dropped to nothing. Ice particles lashed his face like glass. Every step down the ridge felt like walking into the unknown. Behind him, Jeff Lakes was also retreating, but slower, weaker, Lakes managed to reach his tent at a higher camp, just barely. But the storm didn't spare him either. During the night, an avalanche struck. Buried in snow, disoriented and alone, he clawed his way out, but couldn't find his gear. No food, no ice axes, no harness, nothing but sheer will. He began descending the Abruzzi Spur, no tools, no ropes, no backup, just a fading body in a whiteout nightmare. Somehow, he reached Camp 2, and then collapsed. His teammates found him there, barely alive. He died the next day. Back at Camp 4, Hortas and Garcés survived the night, somehow, but frostbite had already taken hold. Their hands were stiff, their feet raw and swollen. They didn't know it yet, but they were the last people to see the summit team alive. Above them, in the heart of the storm, the 6 climbers who had reached the top never came back down. When morning came, the sky was clear again, eerily so. After surviving the night by lying in the snow, Hortas and Garcés stood and looked up toward the summit. There was no movement, no voices, no sign of life. They waited, hoping, scanning the ridgeline for helmets or flashes of color. Nothing. But they couldn't wait long. Both were badly frostbitten, dehydrated, and dangerously weak. With only one pair of gloves between them, they began the slow descent, stumbling down the Sesson route. Every step was pain. Their hands barely functioned. Ice crusted their faces. Still, they moved. Hours later, around 7,400 meters, they saw something strange off to the right of their path. Something out of place. A single boot lying in the snow. A heating device still attached. It was Alison Hargreaves's. They moved closer, and just meters away, they found a violet anorak with a tiny flower motif, soaked in blood. Inside, it was a black climbing harness, also hers. Then they saw the slope. 3 parallel lines of blood etched into the snow, leading down from high above. Not scattered, not chaotic, clean, straight. It meant one thing. 3 bodies had fallen. Hard. Likely from near the summit. Possibly blown off by the wind. And they weren't far from where those lines ended. At around 7,100 meters, nearly 300 meters off the main route, they saw her. A body lying motionless on a flat section of snow at the edge of a line of seracs. Red clothing, still, silent. They didn't go closer, they didn't need to. They knew it was Alison. They stood there for a moment, frozen not by the cold, but by the weight of it all. A mother, a climber, a woman who had stood on the highest point of Earth just months earlier, now lifeless on the slope of K2, the mountain that had finally said, enough. They wanted to bring her down, to bury her properly, but they couldn't. Their bodies were breaking, their hands blackening. They still had to survive. So they turned away and walked back into the storm-shadowed silence of the mountain. That same day, Jeff Lake's body was buried at Camp 2 by his teammates. One more name in the snow, one more family that would never hear another word from the summit. The others, Bruce Grant, Rob Slater, Javier Olivar, Javier Escartin, Lorenzo Ortiz, were never found. No gear, no voices, no second chance. They were some of the best climbers on Earth. No oxygen, no Sherpas, no fixed ropes to guide them down, just strength, grit, and a shared belief that they could beat the odds. And maybe that belief, so powerful, so human, is what doomed them. In the aftermath, those who survived began asking the hard questions. Why did they go for the summit so late in the day? Why didn't anyone turn back when the clouds rolled in? Why didn't someone, anyone, say no? The answer might be found in something far more dangerous than the mountain itself. Groupthink. These climbers weren't reckless. They were smart, experienced, resilient. But when you're up there, starved for oxygen, tired, half frozen, you start looking at the person next to you. If they keep going, so do you. If no one says stop, then no one does. It's easier to keep climbing than to be the one who turns around. Peter Hillary saw it clearly. Everyone's looking at everyone else thinking, they're feeling all right, so it must be all right, he said later. It's hard to go against that. He had turned back, trusted his instincts, watched the weather, and lived. The others never had the chance to doubt their decision. In the days that followed, hope faded. Peter Hillary and the New Zealand team hiked to Broad Peak, base camp, and borrowed a telescope. From there, they scanned the summit and ridges of K2, desperately searching for movement. Any trace of color, a fluttering jacket, a figure stumbling in the snow. But there was nothing. 6 climbers gone, Hillary would later write, and it happened so fast. One storm, one decision. That's all it took. Back at Camp 2, Garcés and Hortas waited for a helicopter. They had survived 6 days without shelter, without real food, both suffering from frostbite so severe they would carry it for the rest of their lives. When the chopper finally came on August 19th, it wasn't rescue, it was escape. They were the last survivors of that summit team. And that's how it ended. Not with a dramatic rescue, not with closure. Just silence, emptiness. Families left with questions that would never be answered. Children who would grow up without parents. Friends who would never get to say goodbye. The mountain had taken what it wanted and offered nothing in return. K2 didn't just take lives in 1995, it took futures. It took a mother from her children, a son from his parents, friends from each other. And yet, in the face of such raw loss, those who knew them remembered something more than tragedy. They remembered strength. Alison Hargreaves, who stood on top of the world alone, without oxygen, without help, without hesitation. A woman who wrote in her journal, not about conquering mountains, but about missing her kids. A climber who had everything to prove, and did, until her very last breath. Rob Slater, wild and relentless, who dared to dream bigger than his resume. He showed up on the savage mountain when most would have stayed home, and he did it with heart, with courage, with fire. And the Spanish team, tight as brothers, sharp as blades, who knew what it meant to face death and still keep climbing. They had already lost one of their own that summer, and still they kept going. Not for glory, but for the climb itself. Because in the end, that's what all of them were chasing. Not a summit, but something deeper. They climbed not just to reach the top, but to meet something ancient, something silent, something that doesn't care who you are or what you've done. K2 doesn't remember the names, but we do. Because the story of that storm, of those climbers and of the choices they made, that lives on. Both suffering from frostbite, not as a warning, so severe they would but carry as a reminder, the rest of their lives. That greatness is never safe. And sometimes, the mountain wins. Dedicated to the climbers of August 1995. Alison, Rob, Bruce, Javier, Lorenzo, Jeff. Gone but never forgotten.